Roots and rigor, rigor and flow. Roots and rigor, rigor and flow. Roots and rigor, rigor and flow. Rigor and flow.
One.
Welcome to Rigour and Flow with
Me, Iwan.
and me, Tamanda, the show where business meets love.
And culture meets critique.
Yes, ma'am. So we have the second of our Feedwarmers, which is the little bit of inspiration and joy we're sharing between this and our next season.
Yep,
And it's my turn.
it is.
Yes.
So what are you bringing to the table to warm up our feed?
Well, I'm very excited about this because I am bringing a podcast known by the name of Sunday School for Misfits by a very, very dear friend of mine who I absolutely adore and who you also know, she's a friend of ours, Dr Selina Stone.
We love Selina.
We do. We got a love of it. Of Selina.
She's amazing.
Yeah, she's brilliant.
What's the podcast about?
If you don't know Selina, you better get to know it. But Selina is a Black womanist theologian. She's like a public theologian who is currently at Edinburgh, the first Black woman theologist of our generation to be in that kind of an institution. So that's kind of a really big deal. We haven't had space in theology and religious studies, which has been very white male dominated. And she created this podcast shortly after finishing her PhD back in October 2022. And it's a podcast that is really rooted in the fact that she was born and raised in Britain to Jamaican parents in a Black Pentecostal church, which will feel very familiar to you.
Oh, it's really, the bells are ringing.
Oh, yeah. And in this podcast, she's kind of reckoning with what were the lessons that were taught in that setting, what of that upbringing is helpful to hold on to, and what is helpful to investigate and maybe consider leaving behind.
Okay, sounds interesting. I mean, I remember the show coming out because we had just started dating.
Had we started dating yet? I thought we had just met.
No, we had just started dating.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Okay.
And I remember when it came out and you told me about it. And I remember thinking, oh my God, she's created the show that I need for my life.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really interesting because you've gone quite different paths in terms of your faith in some ways. Like you're both very much steeped in that tradition. Yeah, I feel like there's so much synergy in her show and ours because both of you've had this very similar grounding.
But we're coming from different perspectives, even within that similar grounding.
Exactly. And almost speaking to different audiences who I think would like each other's stuff as well.
Yeah, definitely. Because she's still within the church, isn't she?
Absolutely.
Yeah, whereas I'm not.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it'd be interesting to hear whether she would say she's in the church. We'll have to bring her on and ask her. Because she even says that she considers herself a tentative Christian.
Oh, okay.
Which we'll get into when we go to the excerpts.
Okay.
But I'll be honest with you, before we get into those, I just want to declare full disclosure. I'm a massive fan of Selina and a long-term friend, but I hadn't listened to and given her podcast the level of care and attention I really wanted to when she launched it, because it came out when I was deep in writing up my PhD and working full-time.
Yeah.
And I knew...
That's a lot.
Yeah, it was a lot. And I knew the kind of topics that she touches on were going to be things I really wanted to chew on, and I just didn't have the bandwidth and time. But to give you a flavour, the kinds of things she touches on, like just the titles alone are sick. They're like...
They really are.
The Marys and the Jezebels Beyond Biblical Womanhood is like one example of a title. Or another one would be, why does the devil's music sound so good?
Because it really does. That's something I really struggled with growing up, because the music, the Christian contemporary music was bad. I mean, our Nigerian music in the church, great, brilliant, loved it. But the stuff that was trying to almost be the Christian alternative to secular music back then was really, really bad. There was only really a few people whose music I really liked, like DC Talk, who were like a Christian rock band. I know it's gotten better over time, but the devil's music is sweet music.
Good. Exactly. I thought you'd like that one. There's also other ones that overlap much more with the kinds of stuff we've done. Like she has an episode on delayed motherhood, which is about faith fertility and frustration, which, I really want to dig deep into that because we've had lots of conversations about that. So maybe a future Feedwarmer will go to that one specifically. She has brilliant guests, people like Father Jarrell Robinson Brown, talking about desire from a queer perspective of someone who's ordained in the church and a Black queer man.
Okay.
So, in terms of thematic crossover, it's just so aligned, even if our angles are slightly different.
Okay. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And there's some juicy titles there.
Juicy. Yes. Very juicy.
So tell me, how did you first meet Selina? Because you weren't studying at the same time or in the same institution, right?
Yeah, no, we weren't. I mean, our studies overlapped a bit. She finished her PhD quite some time before me. But we actually met, it's a bit of a funny story, at this place called Cumberland Lodge.
Sounds royal.
It's very, very regal. So Cumberland Lodge is like one of these amazing stately home houses, which happens to be in the Great Windsor Park where the king lives, or the queen lived up until she
I knew there was
passed
something
away.
royal, because other than the sausage, I mean, it's the next thing is royal.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
It's true. So we met in this place of all places where I had a fellowship as a scholar, and there was a conference being hosted called Life Beyond the PhD. Hilarious. We're now both beyond our PhDs, and podcasting seems to be our life.
And full of life.
Yeah, and thank God.
More life post than during.
More life post for sure. Okay, so we were at that stage still in the grips of PhD life, and I remember that for whatever reason, I think because I was a scholar, I had been given my own room in the space, whereas she had been given a room to share. And I think there was quite a huge difference between her and the person she had been asked to share with. So in the evening, she'd come and hang out in my room, and we bonded quickly and intensely, which is a kind of thing that happens on retreats, I think.
Yeah.
You're in a confined space for 3 days in this weird, stately home. And both of us were going through some challenges. So she wasn't super far out from losing her mum, sadly. So she was, very much in that grief. And at the time, I was in the grief of a divorce. Okay. And so even though it was kind of, she's a bit... Initially, she's cautious as a person, I would say. She's hilarious. She
is so funny.
So
when she
funny.
sends you her voice notes, I am literally dying with laughter.
As soon as I hear her voice, often her voice note will start with just her laughing, and I know she's about to say something.
Or she'll just be like, sis. And then I'm done.
Yeah, exactly. You already know what's coming next. Yeah. You're in for a treat. Yes. It might say 8-minute voice note and you're like, oh, I'm ready for all
settle
of this.
Down.
But it was like that instantly. We took time to open up to each other, but I do remember us having this conversation about grief that night. Mostly, though, we spent the time cackling. So we started sending each other memes. Do you know the film Get Out?
Oh, yeah. Jordan Peele.
Yeah, exactly.
I love that film. King, 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 king. Just stirring the little teacup while he's there wide-eyed, just tears.
Exactly.
Trapped
in some stately home with some white people.
In the armchair.
Yeah. Well, we were obviously in our own stately home. So we started being at the conference and just having banter and sending each other Get Out gifts, and just cracking up about the worlds we find ourselves in academia. And I think it was just an instant connection. I met other great friends there who I've gone on to collaborate with as well, and she was one of them. We then collaborated on a project exploring well-being for Black and global majority heritage clergy in the Church of England, which, as you can imagine, a very white space. And the rest is history,
So what episode have you chosen to warm our feed this week?
I'm going straight in with episode 1.
Okay.
Yeah, I am.
Okay.
And the reason is, I don't think you can listen to Sunday School for Misfits without knowing what a brilliant and wonderful human Selina is. And when you listen to her in episode 1, firstly, she tells us who she is, gives us all the background to how she thinks about the world. Second of all, you hear her sharp wit. Third of all, it's the best of her as a kind of no-nonsense human, right? There's this moment where she says, what this podcast is and what it isn't. And she's just got, she comes through as both really powerful, really clear, really concise, but also just a deeply empathetic, warm person. So I feel everybody should know that person before they listen. So the first clip that I'm going to be sharing from Selina is just her talking about who she is as a person and how that's shaped everything to do with how she thinks about the church, the Bible, and the teachings of Christ.
All of us, whether we're speaking about faith, our lives, or whatever topic it might be, do so from a particular positionality. So who is Selina Stone? Well, I am the granddaughter. I'll start with how I came to exist. I'm the granddaughter of Jamaicans who arrived in Birmingham in the 1960s and the daughter of two great parents. I would say that I'm a very curious person and I'm a bit of a geek. I really like reading, understanding things. I like asking questions. I don't mind not having the answers. I'm the kind of person who's very empathetic, like deeply empathetic, which basically means that I feel way too much. And you'll probably hear some of this come through as I'm talking about different topics and themes, but I really take on board feelings from other people, not even my own. And so that can be a bit difficult at times because I can have what one of my friends and mentors said to me once was an overdeveloped sense of responsibility. But I partly think that also is due to being the oldest sibling. I have 3 younger siblings and a new brother-in-law as of June. So this is really good news. And I'm a Brummie, which you can probably tell if you're listening in any close detail. But probably the important things to say are about my journey in terms of faith and my academic work and research, which actually are tied together in my experience. I grew up in a Black Pentecostal church in Birmingham, and my memories of it are just of a really wonderful community. It was the kind of church my parents had grown up in, where they were like my granddad and one of his good friends had travelled from Jamaica, ended up in the same place, like had their families there and grew up really close. And I feel like in my experience, church has also been that space. And so it makes me think about how important churches have been for Black communities in Britain who've been arriving here and making a life for themselves. And so church for me was a space where I saw lots of Black people, families, parents, kids, young people. I saw women leading, preaching. I saw Black people thriving. And as a young person, it was a space where I felt very much at home. It was a place where I felt I could be myself. And I was really an introverted child, really shy. And church was a place where I could be myself. You know, I was able to lead things and I was able to preach, and people trusted me with responsibility, which I was familiar with because, as I said, I had 3 younger siblings. But it was a good place for me. I felt like I was seen and I was noticed. But I also look back on that time and I think, what else was happening under the surface there? And I think as I've got older, have looked back and thought, I probably did see it as with rose-tinted glasses, but it was a beautiful community for me at the time. But I had a lot of questions as a young person and not a lot of spaces in which to explore them in the depth that I wanted to. And many of these questions were about me growing up in Handsworth in Birmingham and wondering like what difference it made that we had so many churches around the area. Like what difference is any of this actually making to the lives of people like me or the people who lived in this area who are really want to have good opportunities and are dealing with poverty and lack of opportunity. And I felt really frustrated by the really good narrative I used to hear on a Sunday and then a lack of any practical action, like it would actually transform things in real terms. And there were like moments when I saw what might be possible. Like I used to go to youth mission, and our youth mission in the summer, we used to spend time as young people doing community projects and stuff like that, which was fine, but it was only a week. And so then we go back to the usual church stuff. And so I think I felt as if even as a young person, I was getting quite bored of the same church rhythms over and over again. You know, the New Year's program, the youth program, the women's event, the men's thing. I thought, I can't do this the rest of my life. And so I went to university, and that again was another eye-opener in terms of understanding more about politics and history. And I came up from university and I felt that there just wasn't any connection between what I was hearing on a Sunday and what was actually going on in the world as I'd come to understand it. And luckily, like, my dad is a critical thinker. So for us, a lot of the time we would talk at home about these big questions. So I kind of grew up learning that you could think rationally about faith and those things were not opposed to each other. But after university, I was thinking about what to do next. And it was one of the one times when I felt a clear direction from God about anything. And that was about going to Bible college, which I really did not want to do because people send people to Bible college to be a pastor. And I had no interest in doing that at all. And still don't, just for the record, in case anybody wants to give me a false prophecy. And so I basically went there, and that was really my first introduction to academic level study in theology and religion. And it was a difficult journey because you begin and people start questioning things and you're thinking to yourself, are these people even Christian? They're asking whether the snake really spoke to Eve, and you start to think, if that's not true, then what can I believe? But actually, it was a time when I went to some really great classes, and then I then carried that on with my master's degree, my PhD, and so my academic work has really been helping me to process my own life and my experiences. And in reality, like academic study, although people often say don't do it because it's going to jeopardize your faith, for me, academic study and critical reflection on my faith has helped to break down what was false, unnecessary tradition in order to reveal what's genuine and true. And because I've been thinking as I've been living as well, and it's also reflected in my personal faith and journey, it's meant that my academic study has broadened my understanding of my faith. It's really actually helped me to deal with some of the big challenges in my own personal life. When I think about dealing with bereavement and loss, especially when my mum died in 2017, if I hadn't had access to critical reflections on spirituality in the worst times of life because of the work that I had done with Roman Catholic contemplation, I don't know how I would have coped because there wasn't anything in my Pentecostal tradition to help me navigate what the Roman Catholics talk about as the dark night of the soul, when you think that God is dead and everything you've believed is a lie. I didn't have anything in my Pentecostal heritage to help me navigate that. So I think that I would say, contrary to popular opinion, this critical approach has actually really helped me as I've got older, as I've matured in faith and as a person. And so in terms of what I believe now, what I feel relatively sure of, and I'm going to talk about doubt because doubt for me is just a constant thing I have to deal with. And I think this is probably true for lots of us. I call myself a Christian tentatively because what that used to mean and what that means now are two very different things. And so when I was younger, I was very certain, and my certainty was based on nothing but enthusiasm. It hadn't been tested. I hadn't had to live any of this out. I hadn't actually even seen what this meant in real life. It was just like I was believing what I'd been told, and I didn't have any other options, so I didn't really have to choose to believe that. It was just an inherited belief. And that's true for me, even though I was Pentecostal, and we talk like we choose our belief individually, and we don't. We're born into a particular stream of the church, given a particular worldview, and many of us just follow that because that's all we've ever seen. I grew up very sure of lots of things when I was younger, and now a lot more is up in the air. There's a lot more grey than I used to have. But the things that I feel sure about are, I think, the quite important things. And I would say, if I had to say what I believe now, what I feel quite sure of, and this is me on a good day, I would say that I'm sure that I'm someone who exists because of the life of God, who holds and preserves me. I'd say I believe that Jesus is the divine human who helps me to see what God is like and enables me to see what I might be as a human being. If Jesus is fully God and fully man, then I get to see both who God is and who human beings might be when we're fully living in oneness with God and in love with neighbours as well as with ourselves. And so in my life, I want to learn from Jesus' example. But and that means that I realise that my faith cannot be real if it's just a matter of abstract belief. And it can't be genuine or good if it leads me to hate, exclude or discriminate against my neighbour.
That was super interesting. Tell me your thoughts.
Yeah, I love that we get a picture into how Selina was raised and how that shapes her thinking. And it ties directly to the next excerpt that I've chosen, which is her speaking about why the podcast matters, why she's done it, And it feels so aligned with stuff we've talked about on this podcast, you know, this gap that exists between the academy and the people, in her case, in the church, and making sense of the world around them. This is her.
At the moment, in terms of my job, I work full-time for the University of Durham. So this is a new thing. I started this in September. And it's really an answer to prayer because I basically get to spend all of my time doing research, reading, writing. This whole job that I have exists to help me as someone who just finished a PhD to publish as much as I can in terms of academic work, get my thesis published and some papers. But I also really wanted to do something that was accessible, that would be for my friends, for family, for random people on the internet who, for example, are never going to read an 8,000 word paper, but would be happy to listen to a podcast about some of these kinds of topics. Because what I'm really concerned about is a gap that exists between the academy, so lecturers and researchers in universities or people who are working in theological colleges, and the everyday people who are practicing faith or have experienced faith or have experiences of the church. And it feels like there's a huge gap that exists that shouldn't exist. And so this is why I wanted to do this podcast, is to kind of give space to close some of that gap and allow these conversations to be more accessible, rather than them being in a conference somewhere that people have to pay a stupid amount of money to go to. And so that means I'm going to be bringing friends, guests on the podcast too, who are doing research in Black theology, spirituality, and all those kinds of themes, to help us to work through and think through some of these topics. And I'm really quite excited about doing this. On a selfish note, it's basically letting people know what I actually do in my day-to-day life, because I'm sure that my family have no idea. It's worth saying, before I worked at Durham, I worked as a lecturer in theology in a college in London. And before that, I was a community organizer, which was basically just doing grassroots campaigning and helping churches to organize local campaigns with their neighbours, with other organisations locally, to campaign on social justice issues. So that's what I did before I became a lecturer. It was amazing and lots of fun, and it allowed me to put into practice some of those questions I had about the church's engagement with society and all those kinds of things. It was really great.
That's a brilliant clip. It really reminds me of episode 3, where we talked about Hillman Talk.
Yep.
And the way academia, education, the dissemination of knowledge is being revolutionized by Black academics in America through social media, specifically TikTok.
Yeah.
So I love that she's talking about these things.
Exactly. And that her podcast is a version of that. It's making accessible the knowledge that's needed for the people and the questioning that she's living out loud for her listeners.
Exactly.
It's great. The third thing that I wanted to pull out from her first episode is what she talks about as her putting her stakes in the ground about what her podcast is and what it isn't, because it is just so reflective of Selina as a person. I'm no nonsense. Here's who I am. This is what it is. And I'm also not gatekeeping. If you're looking for other things, don't come looking for me. But here are all these other brilliant people who are doing this, that, and the other. Here's her talking.
For me, the critical conversations about theology, what we're believing and what impact it's having on our lives, on our decisions, is a conversation that's missing at the moment. And it's missing, I think, because lots of us are nervous about sharing what we think online and the backlash we might get by inviting people into critical conversations, because Christians, like everybody else, are really bad at just accepting that there are different perspectives. And what we like to do is question a person's whole Christian faith if they see a Bible scripture vaguely differently to how we see it. And I honestly think it's just immature, because if we're all reading a Bible that's been compiled over hundreds of years and translated multiple times, and none of us were there. Some of what's recorded in here didn't even literally happen. I mean, I'm not going to go into that because I don't want to freak anyone out too much in episode 1. But the point I'm making is we're all having to do interpretation. So it's very likely that me bringing what I bring to the text, I'm going to see something different to what you are going to see when you come to the text. Similarly, if I'm a Pentecostal, you're an Anglican or a Roman Catholic, we might have different emphases on the Bible. And that doesn't have to degrade into this mocking of other traditions or this patronizing way of talking about other Christians. And it makes me really sad when I see that, because I find it embarrassing. It's like at this big age, can we not just accept that we're going to see things quite differently? When I read the text as a Black woman who grew up in Handsworth, I'm going to see things very differently from somebody who's grown up in a very middle-class, white and very affluent area. We're going to have different things are going to speak to us. But what happens is we end up creating hierarchies about whose perspective we think we should listen to and whose we think should be ignored.
I love her energy, I'm not going to lie.
It was a masterclass.
The show, in person, her work as a powerful theologian, womanist, academic researcher. Critical thinker. Yeah. I just love her energy.
Yeah, me too. You can see why we became fast friends, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, finally, I want to introduce one last excerpt, which I just think it's really important to understand what Selina's invitation is, and what her call to action is for her listeners. She does gear this towards other Black Christians, but, I think it could be relevant to lots of people. And what she's saying is this podcast is an invitation into the grey and into a space of uncertainty. And I like that she is giving other Christians a space to not know, for doubt to exist alongside faith. And just to be really clear about that, that's her way of doing things.
Yeah, and it's very human. To doubt is really human.
Yes.
And the church wants to shut that down because actually too much questioning might expose some of the cracks.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what we're going to need to do is commit to listening even when it's difficult, to trust that people who are not like us might point to us and say, you've got a plank in your eye. And do we have the humility to stop and let them take the plank out of our eye to help us to see more clearly? We need to be willing, I think, to tell the truth and to hear the truth and to hold together multiple stories about things that we think are simple. I can talk about my amazing church experience, but also I need to be able to listen to that person who says they were suicidal in sermons because they were gay and the pastor was talking about them going to hell, was singling them out. I have to listen to a sister tell me that she is a survivor of sexual abuse and the church did nothing to deal with what had happened to her when it was someone in the church who did it. Like, I can't block out those stories and say, oh, well, my church experience was great. I'm mad if I do that. I have to be able to listen to stories that challenge my perception of what happened, especially when those stories are stories from people who've suffered, who are traumatized and marginalized in the church. And so this is what I'm asking of you all as you listen, as you take part, is to be mindful of your privilege. We talk about privileges a lot when it comes to race, but there's all kinds of privileges. If you are a heterosexual, non-trans person, you are seen as normal by most people in the world, and therefore you have some privilege. You can talk about your sexuality, your relationship, and not have to worry about what anyone's going to say. You can be who you are, talk openly, express your love openly, with, obviously with some boundaries, and people are going to genuinely think this is lovely and beautiful. If you're somebody who's married in the church, you already know. If you don't know, now you know. Like, you have a whole lot of privilege in the church. If you're a woman, that is included because you gain privilege by nature of being married. You have access to leadership that lots of single women would never get an opportunity to have because you're married. Privileges are everywhere. If you're a middle class, upper class person in the church, tons of economic privilege that people in your congregation who are working class, who are coming from poorer backgrounds, don't have access to. That's going to give you privileges and power in the church because you have money. All of these things are going on in our congregations that we have often not named. And I hope that we will be attentive to that in our conversations and attentive to those around us who do not have the privileges that we have, and that we will give our space to people to speak their truth in our conversation. So we have to be willing to tell the truth about leadership, about abuse of power, cultures of abuse, alongside the stories of beauty and community and healing and joy. Multiple things can be true. I've experienced wonderful care from pastors and friends within and beyond churches. And I've also experienced spiritual abuse and mistreatment at the hands of church leaders. it means that I'm super cautious about who I speak to and who I allow into my life now. And we need to be able to tell the truth about that. And so this podcast really is an invitation into the grey. And this is why I call this episode Welcome to the Grey, because most of life sits there. You know, we might think life is quite black and white, but in reality, a lot of life, a lot of faith, a lot of our spirituality, a lot of our journey with God sits within this space of uncertainty and tension. And so we need to be aware of the grey when it comes to processing our experiences, which are often a mixture of things, not often fully good or fully bad. Our experiences of people, of church, particular things that have happened to us. Some of them can be like categorically said to be bad or entirely good, but a lot of the time they're a combination. We might think about the pastors or the leaders we've known as having both good and bad things about them as well. And to be truthful, that same tension is within ourselves. I can be kind and I can be selfish. I can be thoughtful and I can be thoughtless. I can be sure and I can be uncertain. And I think when we can accept that in ourselves, it makes it easy for us to then forgive that in other people. It is actually just what it is to be human.
Why did those clips stand out for you, and what did you learn in listening to them?
I mean, it's an easy answer in terms of why. They just so aligned with so much that we're about. But what I like about Selina is she comes at it from such a different angle, partly because she's so embedded in the church. Or no, she's not embedded in the church, I would say, in her faith.
Okay. And that's a big difference.
Yes. Yeah, a massive difference. And I really I've always really, for some reason, admired people who have both a strong conviction and a strong faith, but a willingness to hold what they don't know and a willingness to live questions, because even if I myself don't practice in that way, it's something I really try to embody and value seeing modeled for me in the world, you know?
Yeah.
And in terms of what did I learn? I mean, some of the fun of listening to this is, you know, you feel like you know someone because you spent time with them, but there's nothing like listening to them share their story and their reason in a single episode setting to just like hear it all again or hear new things that you'd never heard before. I sometimes feel that recording with you.
I was going to
tell a story.
I was going to say, like, even in our show, I mean, obviously we're married and I've heard some of the stories before, but there's something about being in this space where it's really intentional.
Yeah.
Like you're really, really listening. Not that I don't listen to you.
You do listen very well, but I know what you mean.
Do you know what I mean? It's like I hear the stories anew and they hit my heart in different ways. And I feel like I'm seeing different sides to you, you know?
Yeah.
And I love that.
I love it too. And I feel exactly the same with you. I mean, sometimes I hear new things like I did with Selina, but a lot of the time I hear old things anew.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
Yeah.
So thinking about our audience specifically, now that we know a bit more about who's listening to the show after season 1, why should they listen to Sunday School for Misfits?
Yeah, it's a good question. We definitely know we have people listening who are Christian or who have been inspired by your story because they've left the church and are struggling to find a place. I think that Sunday School for Misfits is a podcast that may make people embedded in the faith who like to question feel very seen, affirmed and liberated to live their questions alongside their faith or their changing relationship to faith. And I think it's super needed. I also think we've had some listeners who've struggled with particularly our first episode on can you be African, Christian and gay?
Yep.
I just think, you know, although I'm not a practicing Christian, if I was, I would seriously want to hold my faith like Selina and be looking for interpretations that, you know, affirm the things she says, which is that I had this great experience of church, but I realized that I had siblings, I had people in there who experienced horrific homophobia, who experienced horrific abuse. And I believe that in looking to be a Christian, I need to both uphold the joy and the community and all the great things I got from this environment, but also stare and reckon with some of the unspeakable things that happen.
Yes.
And so I feel like even for those people who are really challenged by some of our episodes, hers is a great podcast to just give you space to still be a Christian and still ask new questions of yourself as you're growing, you know? Apart from that, I think there's another group of people. There's clearly people who are listening to us who have either no faith or they're definitely not of the Christian faith. And I think, I'm someone who loves studying religion and theology. And my love of that is I'm endlessly fascinated by human beings, how we make sense of the world, how we look at difficult issues, how we respond to challenge or things that confront us. And I think it's just going to be an eye-opening listen for anyone who is curious about fellow humans.
I love that. You can listen to the full episode wherever you get your podcasts, and the name of the show is Sunday School for Misfits, and it is created and hosted by the powerhouse that is Dr. Selina Stone.
I really hope you enjoy it as much as I did.